Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower, educate, and inspire men in a positive way. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inspired Change. Well, peace has been shattered. It's interesting that the podcasts that I've done before were sort of heralding in the issue of how peace and individual well-being is intrinsically intertwined. And although I didn't have a crystal ball, it was fairly obvious within the media what was going to unfold in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And as always, one could argue that there are two sides of the story, but when we have a situation as we're seeing in the Ukraine, I really do need to question that quite intensely. I really need to exercise as much critical thinking about that as possible, because whether we like it or not, wars have always been accompanied by misinformation, by a strategic and tactical propaganda approach. And if I apply this whole thing to the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, the most obvious thing that stands out to me is, in fact, Putin's background. And as an ex-KGB agent, Putin is a master at misinformation and manipulation in various ways, how to destabilize communities, how to destabilize, in many respects, countries. I don't have any evidence to that effect of the leadership in the Ukraine. And I know that there's some strong reports, around about, the fact that Ukraine was committing genocide and so on. And again, I don't have any evidence of that. I don't see anything within the media that, unless it's tied up and in some way can be traced down to propaganda from Russia, namely Putin. Because I have to really question whether the Russian people are in fact on board with this. So how can we learn to understand this particular conflict? And it is a major marker in our history, modern historical context, because Europe fundamentally has been without a war for approximately 80 years. There's not been an armed conflict on the European soil. And here we are suddenly in the 21st century, where a democratically elected leader and his country are under direct military attack and have been invaded. It's not a peacekeeping exercise. A peacekeeping exercise doesn't come along in the way that we've seen the Russian army present itself within the borders of the Ukraine. And so let me talk a little bit about Putin and what I think is going on for Putin. And again, got to keep in mind that I'm not diagnosing this man. He's never presented to me as a client, so I can't really do that. But what we can do is we can make some fairly well-informed assumptions and possibly, do what the FBI does, which is to profile someone, looking at how this person presents, how they engage with others, how they, and their behavior, how they act within certain spheres. So a little bit of a historical snapshot. Essentially, Putin came to the attention at the fall of the Iron Curtain. He had been, I think, a lieutenant colonel stationed in East Germany as an agent, but to all intents and purposes, his job was as a translator. And Putin's earlier history is one in which he appears to have been completely embedded in the ideology of the Soviet. And so the only assumption that I can make with someone like Putin is that when you've got your identity tied up so closely with your nation, your patriotism, and you're prepared to put your life on the line for that nation and its allies, then the loss of that, the fall of the Soviet Empire would sting. And in psychology, we talk about a deep-seated narcissistic wound. In other words, it was a blow, an almost mortal blow to his identity, his sense of self within the context of his role, i.e., KGB, intelligence officer. And so, one of the things that he showed as a result of the fall of the Soviet Empire was that he was highly flexible and adaptable within the machine of what remained in Russia. So he, in fact, positioned himself very well within the government, and he rose quite quickly in that newly established government to become its leader. So, what happens to a man then in that sort of context? Why is he, striving for the highest position? Well, the only understanding that I can make of this is that he is essentially out for as much power and influence as he can muster. So the next question is, for what purpose? Now, I've always held the belief since the fall of the Soviet Union that there will be some people within what has remained within Russia who have lamented the loss of the USSR, the mighty empire. And so Putin very cleverly, and through his connections as being an ex-KGB agent and in the FSB, rallied around him people who were willing and who were going to support his vision. I don't think Putin ever let go of the vision of a Soviet empire. He wasn't going to call it a Soviet empire because we've been there, done that. It needs to be something new. It needs to be something special. So this was his way of compensating for essentially his narcissistic wound. And in that space, it's not inconceivable that much of his thinking strategically was, how do I get back at the ideology that brought my country, my empire to its knees, that I've had to struggle to rebuild? I think the two are intertwined. I don't think there's a separation necessarily in Putin's mind. And if we listen to some of the speeches he's recently made, and the way that he has reconstructed history to serve his sense of empiricism, the empire, and how different countries fit into that, and the ideologies that he attacks, like National Socialism. It's very, very interesting how that presents in his speeches and his reasoning behind that. Much of which is, a bit like the Republicans rewriting history. And in a way, there's similarities there. So I believe that Putin, for a very, very, very long time, has been looking for openings to destabilize the source, or what he sees as the source of his wound, and the wound of Russia. And he does feel more than likely that he is the defender of Mother Russia, and that he has a sworn duty to put it back together again. Now, unfortunately, that also puts him in an exceptionally potent position, because he sits on a military machine that's almost unrivaled in many respects. Russia has more nukes around than anybody else. And so, here we have a man who, and some people suggest that he's become deranged. I've got no real evidence other than, one or a couple of rambling sort of speeches, that he's completely unstable and he could push the button. I think he potentially could push the button on nukes. I mean, he's already raised the nuclear threat. that if the West interferes, he will rain upon the West weapons that they've never seen before. So, do we think he's just bluffing? Do we take him seriously? I tend to think that anybody who threatens suicide I take seriously. And I'm very deliberate in putting that together. So how is this relevant to me talking about patriarch? Well, Putin is the quintessential patriarch. And he did a couple of things that really highlighted that. He understood that when a leader, a king, or a dictator aligns themselves with the religious authority, he has a very powerful influence on the population. And given the fact that in the USSR environment, it was fundamentally an atheist country, religion was sort of barely tolerated, the people never gave up on their beliefs in religion. The Russian Orthodox Church continued to, do their service to the people. And so when Putin, allowed the churches to become open again, the people were grateful to him. They saw him very much as the father that, had a reflection within the Orthodox patriarchy. So I talk about patriarchy in terms of the values of it, being territorial, being hierarchical, being acquisitional, and being competitive. And also then if these things are threatened in any way, the patriarch becomes combative. And Putin has ticked all those boxes. There is no quibbling about that. He has found a point in time in which he assessed that the West was weak enough to initiate a military action and to have the belief that that military action would be over quickly and that it would be, by and large, unchallenged. Why? Because that's exactly what happened in Crimea. Crimea was a test case. I said that at the time to a friend of mine, is that this is just the beginning. And that is an important aspect to consider in this conflict with Ukraine, which is an invasion. He did what Hitler did to Poland. The excuse was, we're going to take care of the Germans living in the west of Poland, and we're going to protect them. And Putin's using exactly the same rhetoric with the breakaway, Russian dissidents in the east of the Ukraine. It's really no different at all. You've got to keep in mind that I grew up in a family that had gone through World War II who happened to be on the German side, and so I got a lot of stories about what was happening around that time. And again, I don't see any difference here. Putin's playing Hitler's playbook. Hopefully, we don't have a Chamberlain that tries to appease. Now, I'm not calling, for people to go to war. What I'm saying is that, we need to be very, very clear that Putin, having embarked on this path, that to him, in a sense, as much as the Ukrainians talk about no surrender, we need to factor into this, Putin's ego and what is put on the line here. And it's not going so well for him either within Ukraine or within Russia. There is a growing level of opposition. There's always been some opposition, but Putin's always maintained a murderer's hold. People who oppose him end up in jail, or they get killed, they get poisoned, and it doesn't matter where on the planet they are, by the look of it, they seem to get taken out of the picture. This is a completely different arena in which he's operating. And it's possible to argue that he's bitten off more than he can chew. The question is, what is a patriarch like that in combat likely to do to maintain the rhetoric, but also the position and the public face? That's the public face that is becoming frayed. His public image is very important to Putin, like it is to most narcissists, malignant narcissists. And there's a reasonable argument to suggest that Putin is actually, suffering, well, maybe not suffering, that he is a psychopath, that he has ideas of grandiosity, and that he fundamentally is highly Machiavellian. So there's this triad there. So, when I listen to people who are going, talking about there's two sides to the story, we need to tread very, very, very carefully, because that was also one of the factors that was played out at the beginning of World War II, is that, well, we need to see it from Germany's perspective. Well, the German people didn't get a chance to actually have an informed conversation or debate about what was happening, because the Nazis drove a propaganda machine that was extraordinarily powerful, and Putin's installed that into the government-owned media in Russia. And anyone who doesn't agree doesn't get a voice on that. It's only people who agree with Putin's line that are able to speak on this. So yes, patriarchy has once more shown to shatter peace and to be destructive. And I think that in the 21st century, we the people need to come together, and we the people, in the words of Anonymous, are legion, and we can make a change. Possibly the strongest and most fruitful way of changing is what we're seeing in terms of the economic sanction. And Russia ultimately can only be viewed through the lens of kleptocracy, is that the elite has stolen the riches of the country. And the other bit that I think we need to look at is, very seriously at our reliance on energy, on fuels from places that are run by dictators. And fundamentally, I think that that's relevant to our relationship with China as much as it is now with our relationship with Russia. And it was good to see that companies like BP and Shell have withdrawn their, commercial activities from Russia, because partly, we if we go to war, this is going to be, singularly the most devastating thing that can happen globally to the world, and I think we need to find alternative solutions, if at all possible, and hopefully, that can be achieved. One of the things that can happen is that Putin's stranglehold over the Russian people who are protesting this invasion of the Ukraine, a democratic, independent country, will come together to solve this problem themselves, and it won't be dependent on the West to solve it. But then we've also in the West have got to sort out our own problems. We need to rethink our economic, story that we tell ourselves. We need to deconstruct patriarchy. We need to deconstruct neoliberalism, a poison that's been coursing through the veins of Western nations and that has been destabilizing democracy progressively, because neoliberalism fundamentally is only there for the good of the few and not for the good of the many. So, how does this relate to individual well-being? Well, imagine being in Kiev at the moment, or in any of the territories of the Ukraine with bombs raining down on you. Now, your psychological well-being is secondary to you staying alive. And so that's how we need to look at well-being, is that ultimately, in anything less than a true democracy, our liberties, our freedoms, and our safeties and well-being are consistently compromised. And we need to protect those, and we need to come together and collectively make sure that they're not infringed on, individually, in families and communities, nations. Now, that doesn't mean that we become nationalistic, because that's the very thing that dictators tend to tweak, is our nationalism. They stoke it until the embers burst into flame and us becomes, narcissistically dominant over the others who are inferior or wanting or lacking. We're human beings, we're all equal. at least at the soul. So we need to preserve that. On that somewhat sad note, but we need to inspire change. So let's think about this. Let's think about what we need to do locally and globally to continue to dismantle the threat of patriarchy and the threat of neoliberalism. Until next week, this is me signing off.
Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email miranda@nortainment.com. That's miranda@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.